There we go. And hello and welcome everyone. So uh last time we left off on a pretty sour note with Jim Crow being implemented in the US and a steady decline into what was known as the nadir of American race relations. But the um today's going to start off kind of happy but turn pretty nasty pretty quickly. Um, that's unfortunately the way of American history is that things get worse before they get better sometimes. Um, so uh, Today we're going to be talking about the Spanish War, the Spanish American War. Hold on a second while I hit screen share. Well, before I do, are there any questions from last time? No, about Jim Crow and all that. No? All right, cool. Let's hit share this. Cool. There we go. There we go. And so today we're going to be talking about the Spanish American War. Now, the this scene is often depicted as a jaunty little quick war, but people tend to forget its aftermath. Um and it has lasting consequences. For instance, you've heard about Puerto Rico in the news plenty recently, and we only have Puerto Rico because of this war. Um, but the beginning of it didn't really focus on Puerto Rico or the Philippines or Guam or any of the other places that ended up having lasting consequences from this. Instead, the beginning of this war has more to do with Cuba. If it'll change over, thank you. So, Cuba today is independent only because of this war. And yes, Chase, that was Teddy Roosevelt. He was he we'll get to why he's there. So um Cuba was a Spanish possession and remained a Spanish possession all the way into the 1890s. Um, but the U.S. had long since tried to grapple with Cuban independence movements. The U.S., under the Monroe Doctrine, heavily um, supported, at least through rhetoric, independence. But um, that independence movement actually came about mostly on the back of of not actual American government intervention, but American citizens interventions, private interventions called filibusters. Um, so Cuba. Cuba had a series of wars of independence, and the first one in 1844. Um, and following the Mexican American War, which gave which took the place that we are in now, New Mexico, and several other parts of the U.S. from Mexico, this instilled the spirit of filibusterism. We've talked a little bit about filibusters before, but one of these what filibusters are private expeditions. Essentially, they are well, the origin of the term comes from the Dutch word "vliegtuig," but it it as just their word for freebooter. Freebooter being another word for pirate. And so essentially what these people were trying to do was steal land. That's what it really comes down to. Filibustering is stealing land. Now, we you might hear about filibusters in the Senate today. The origin of that term was actually based around filibusters into Cuba. Um, uh, one of the people who really supported Cuban independence and wanted to basically take Cuba for his own and possibly have it annexed by the United States was a guy named Narciso Lopez. And he tried a couple of expeditions into Cuba. The final one in 1851, he got captured and executed like a pirate, filibuster pirate. And so filibusters don't really normally go too well, but what's significant about this is this flag, the Cuban flag that we see today, was Narciso Lopez's flag. He actually included that star on there specifically to entice Americans to join with him into the expedition so that they could eventually annex Cuba into the United States. That star actually represents another star to the United States flag. So, but then it kind of morphed into its own thing with subsequent wars of independence. And you can see right here the various years they had several attempted revolutions, all that were put down pretty nastily, especially in 1844. It was the worst because of what was known as the Years of the Lash. Basically, anybody who supported independence was publicly flogged or whipped for having supported it. Many people were flogged to death. And so seeing all this stuff, America really supported Cuban independence from Spain. After all, Mexico had gained independence, basically all of Latin America, save for a few Spanish possessions in the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico and Cuba. So all of this wanton cruelty didn't really help the Spanish cause. And so newspapers in the US started basically calling for war, calling for solving this issue by US intervention, by the US actually intervening on behalf of Cuban independence movements. But remember, a lot of this started because of a filibuster, with this flag, with that star right there, supposedly for eventual US annexation. So there's kind of a dual purpose for why these newspapers were calling for that. But there was also in the 1890s a push toward more sensational news. This was called the Yellow Press after a comic that was running in the New York Tribune, and two New York newspapers were basically competing for who can out sensationalize each story. So they'd have some story about like some lady who got stabbed by her husband, and turns out that it was that her husband had poked her too hard with his finger. That was literally a thing that both of them did. And these competing newspapers were ran by one guy named William Randolph Hearst and another guy named Joseph Pulitzer. And they basically competed for who could sell the most papers, especially since at this point suddenly people were having more and more subscriptions to newspapers, and also buying what's called extra copy. That newsboy on the corner going, extra, extra, read all about it. Well, that was fueled by yellow journalism. And so they were, taking these stories and running wholesale with them. So you could guess what, when they turned their sights on Cuba, how, some stories can get blown out of hand. And as the independence movement in the 1890s ramped up, of course, so did yellow journalism start to follow suit. And so the U.S. sent sent a ship, a naval ship called the USS Maine, into Havana Harbor, basically to say like none of that, years of the lash BS on our watch. We're going to make sure that you cannot impose such cruel measures on this independence movement. But it was really just there to you know be present. It didn't have any ability to intervene or anything unless it received news otherwise. But suddenly it blew up. Um, the the Maine just blew up in the Havana Harbor, um, killing a great deal of Americans in the process, of course. Now, um, the U.S. immediately held an investigation and declared that it was because of a mine in the harbor. But um, that didn't really. The Spanish held their own investigation, and they said that it was a coal explosion. And interestingly enough, there were actually several other ships of this class um, that had blown up in similar ways that were from coal explosions, igniting the battery as in all the shells, and uh, and blowing up the ship. None of them had been this catastrophic, nowhere close to this catastrophic, but you could see that because part of the problem was that the furnace and part of the design of this ship is that the furnace wall was right next to the bulkhead that held all the ammunition. You could see there's a bit of a problem with this design. But normally when that would go off, it would just set off a few rounds, and that was it. Um, Not have this massive explosion that utterly destroys the ship. That seems to indicate that it was a mine, and there is no definitive answer on this. There have been several investigations since then. Um, in fact, in 1911, the U.S. actually declared that it was in fact a mine or torpedo. The term torpedo used to just mean mine, um, and the Spanish actually relinquished their claim in 1899. So so there's a bit of back and forth on this, on what the actual causes of this explosion were. But that didn't matter because newspapers were going to drum it up all they could. So, you know, while these investigations are going on, you have the New York World, which is ran by Joseph Pulitzer, and then the New York Journal. Actually, I think I'm mixing up the two. Either way, one's ran by William Randolph Hearst, one's ran by Joseph Pulitzer, and you can see from this news coverage, there's big explosions with like literal debris and of people up in the air and all that kind of stuff. And very clearly, you know, was it a bomb or torpedo? It's like, well, could it be something else? You could see the entirely misleading way these things were ran by. And you'll notice a character that will be recurring a lot in the next few lectures is Assistant Secretary Roosevelt, as in Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Obviously, this is a Navy ship blowing up, and so kind of falls under his purview. And Teddy Roosevelt, being the boisterous guy he was was pretty convinced himself of this. Of course, he might have had ulterior motives, as in trying to start a war. But whether or not it was a torpedo, is up in the air. But these newspapers managed, though, notice that they're never saying that it was. They're saying, "Oh, he's convinced that it was, not an accident." is it a bomb or torpedo? They always hedge their bets with those question marks. Um, but managed to convince the US public that now was time to declare war. And indeed, war was declared on the 25th of April, 1898, on Spain. Um, Even though the US would make no attempt to invade Spain itself, the war would indeed be over Spain's colonial possessions. So the um, the Spanish American War was actually fairly quick. Like there was hardly any major fighting. It just took a couple of months to really get things going. Troops started forming up in Florida to make the jump over to Cuba. And once they did, they faced very little resistance. It was actually fairly easy to conquer Cuba. But that Secretary of the Navy decided to go and form his own, what are called volunteer cavalry. Essentially, at this point in time, you could organize your own military unit and then be adopted within the U.S. military as a volunteer unit. And so the first cavalry volunteers was organized under Teddy Roosevelt. They became known as the Rough Riders. Um, and this was basically a big publicity stunt. But um, but he did manage to have one major victory during this jaunty little war, um, known as the Battle of San Juan Hill, as pictured here. Of course, what is often forgotten about the Battle of San Juan Hill is that his unit was basically saved by the Ninth Cavalry. These guys right here. You might notice that there are black. The Ninth Cavalry was also known as Buffalo Soldiers. Um, and they kind of saved the Rough Riders, but that didn't really make it into the newspapers. At the height of at the beginning of Jim Crow, you can understand why newspapers were avoiding talking about that, especially when Roosevelt is doing this as kind of a big publicity stunt. Um, he would become president fairly soon afterward. But that'll wait, and we'll talk about that next week. Um, but yeah, so the Rough Riders, conquered San Juan Hill, big victory and everything. But then the U.S. started to invade Puerto Rico, and basically fell into a stalemate. The fighting there led to trench warfare, and people just kind of dug in and started to duke it out by lines, despite the fact that the Navy had the entire island surrounded. But also the Navy started heading west from California. Um, and they started hitting Spanish possessions in the Pacific. First, they hit Guam. Just surrounded Guam and said surrender. And obviously, with the full might of the American Navy against the puny little couple of ships that were at Guam, nobody was willing to try to fight the U.S. in Guam. So they quickly surrendered. The U.S. captured Guam, left a ship there, and started heading to Spain's most profitable possession, the Philippines. And so Admiral Dewey, the guy who was in charge of this Pacific squadron, picked up a guy named Aguinaldo, Emilio Aguinaldo, who was languishing just north of Hong Kong, basically as a political exile. But because of his push for independence that had been waging in the Philippines for decades, the Dewey promised Aguinaldo that hey, if you join us and make a competent fighting force, we'll back you up, and you can get some independence. So they pull into Manila Bay and wiped out the Spanish fleet in actually kind of a spectacular thing, because the Spanish fleet far outnumbered the American fleet, and yet the U.S. managed to outmaneuver them and just completely destroy the Spanish fleet. Um, so this led to the Spanish just surrendering after only 4 months of this war. Um, Interestingly enough, this war also had the effect of uniting the North and South of the United States, because remember, the Civil War had happened only 40 years prior, um, and 45 years. But the one of the people who was in charge of the U.S. forces in Cuba um, was a former Confederate general, which the President McKinley, had promoted to being commander of the cavalry. So this guy's name is known as Fighting Joe Wheeler, and Joe Wheeler, or Fighting Joe, um, was kind of a reformed Confederate, right? And so putting him in charge of the cavalry was kind of this big unifying thing. And and just think about this. That means that Teddy Roosevelt was fighting under the command of a former Confederate general. So you could see all that publicity that was surrounding Teddy Roosevelt, because also realized the Rough Riders were composed of a whole menage of just like weird frontiersmen and gunslingers, many of who came from New Mexico, by the way. And so this like kind of perfect thing for all that yellow journalism happening followed Teddy Roosevelt, and him being under the command and Fighting Joe meant that Northerners and Southerners were kind of coming to terms with what had happened 45 years ago. But this was also kind of the big announcement in the from having fought such a civil war to now being on the international stage as a global imperial power. Because the US was pretty obviously determined to take control of Spanish possessions, and that is precisely what we did with the Treaty of Paris in 1898. So the even though all of this was focusing mostly on Cuba, right? Well, a Ryder amendment during the war was passed by Congress, stating that we could not annex Cuba. That after all, the war had been fought to preserve Cuban independence, and how dare the U.S. take control of such a thing? Later on, the Platt Amendment stated, because obviously Cuba remained under U.S. military control despite having declared official independence. The Platt Amendment said that the U.S. had to withdraw by 1901. So 3 years of martial law would somehow make Cuba ready for independence. A kind of a apprenticeship, you could say. But the constitution that was created for Cuba said that the U.S. could just intervene anytime we wanted in Cuba, without Cuba's permission or anything along those lines, that we could literally just unilaterally intervene, so long as we saw that our interests were at stake. But despite not getting the crown jewel of Cuba, the U.S. managed to to annex several other territories, including Puerto Rico and Guam, both of which we have today. Um, and for the Philippines, since the Philippines wasn't exactly the focus of the war and everything, and it was Spain's, like, you know, golden possession, um, we paid $20 million for. Um, but remember how Admiral Dewey had promised Aguinaldo support for his independence movement? Well, this seems like a bit of a stab in the back, does it not? They fought for Philippines independence just to have it annexed by the United States. Um, what uh, what a uh, what a treacherous act, right? The Philippine like Aguinaldo had no representation in Paris when this treaty was being made, and also it's not like the people who were negotiating this had any idea what some admiral in the Philippines had promised. So bit of a miscommunication, but it's in the U.S.'s best interest to take Spain's most profitable colony and annexed it as a colony. It was an official U.S. colony. So Aguinaldo didn't really like this. And so he declared the first Filipino Republic. Um, and tried at least for a few weeks to get the US to recognize the independence of the Filipino Republic. Well, no, the US wanted all of the riches of the Philippines, all that spice and all that gold. Um, so, um, after weeks of saying of trying to negotiate with the U.S. and trying to get the U.S. to relinquish their claim to the Philippines, Aguinaldo declared war on the U.S. Um, this ignited what's known as the Philippine Insurrection, um, and it is possibly our nastiest war. Um, and that's saying something, right? When things like the Civil War um, exist in Vietnam and whatnot. Um, but this was worse. Um, so the the worst fighting was right at the beginning when Aguinaldo tried to take Manila. Um, you know, he his forces, the Republicans, tried to attack U.S. forces, often by massacring them. There were several massacres right at the beginning of the war, hence why it's more of an insurrection than a war. Um, and um, but the U.S. was pretty easily put that down, um, and was able to take full control of Manila rather quickly. Um, but throughout 1899, there would be a series of massacres from both sides. Um, it was massacres kind of escalated as the U.S. took offense, obviously, from these upstart Filipinos and realized there's a great deal of racism behind that. Um, that um, that how dare they attack our troops? We just liberated them from the Spanish, even though just to impose our own colonial rule. Um, and so it degenerated into colonial warfare. And something you have to understand about the Philippines is it's just a bunch of islands, so it's really hard to control. You capture one rebel base, and they go off to another island. Um, you know, and set up a base there, and so on and so forth. And the raiding and counter raiding just escalates steadily. Um, so because of this escalating guerrilla warfare, I also realized that um, the U.S. that American soldiers think that guerrilla warfare is dishonorable and is we fought a war for your independence. How dare you? Um, and especially they don't like seeing their comrades being killed. Um, and so not only do they turn to massacring random Republicans, but they also turn to old Spanish tactics known as the water cure. And essentially, what the water cure is that you take a big funnel and shove it into somebody's mouth and start pouring water down that funnel. It's kind of like waterboarding, if you know what that is, but worse. Waterboarding is just the sensation of drowning. This is actually drowning, and being forced to drown. So it was torture, but it's also a very torture is kind of useful to find those kinds of rebel bases, because the Philippines are a bunch of islands. They're also heavily forested. They're basically jungles. So tramping around in the jungle um, makes it really difficult to find these bases, especially considering you want to find them before they find you. Um, so the U.S. also turned to concentration camps. This is actually the term that the U.S. called them. These were actual concentration camps. Well, something you have to understand about concentration camps is not that people tend to associate them with Nazis and that, but concentration camps simply means to concentrate a population. That's the meaning of it. And so the camps themselves were not particularly deadly. The point of these concentration camps is to put a population to concentrate a population into a green zone and then say that anyone outside of this green zone is fair game. We're just going to sweep the entire island and kill anyone who is of fighting age. Um, and so you can tell this got really nasty. And also, part of the problem with putting people in concentration camps is that they can no longer farm. And so suddenly there's a bunch of death because of starvation, because, well, nobody's working the farmland anymore. They're all in concentration camps. Um, so because of these dirty tactics, there's a great debate over what the casualty count is, but a good number is around 500,000 dead. 500,000. So this is genocide. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, this is genocide. So the U.S. turned from, just a few massacres of our own troops to just straight up genocide. Aguinaldo was eventually captured in 1901 by kind of a daring raid on a rebel camp by this guy named Filson, who took a couple of local constabularies, basically Filipino troops fighting as like that, are in the army, but are more like policemen, and they're fighting on behalf of the U.S. Took a couple Filipino constabularies, infiltrated the camp, grabbed Aguinaldo from a window, and dragged him out in broad daylight. Managed to escape across a river with Aguinaldo in tow. So, this kind of broke the back of the Filipino Republic, but there'd be several attempts to reorganize it. The second one was also known as the Tagalog Republic, was formed. Tagalog is their language, by the way. Was formed quickly thereafter, and they continued the fight for several years, all the way into 1903. In July of 1902, this another soon-to-be president named Taft came over as the kind of the military governor, although he wasn't in the military himself. He's way too fat for that. But helped administer the creation of the Philippine Assembly, essentially home rule. Even though it was still a U.S. colony, and would remain so until after World War II. This was essentially granting independent rule of the colony to the people within the colony. Um, Also, Filipinos were never granted American citizenship. They were considered a foreign colony and therefore subservient to the U.S. But home rule allowed them to at least make their own laws in that, even though the U.S. would often appoint their own governor. Um, and in 1903, Teddy Roosevelt granted general amnesty to those still fighting, and so this kind of ended the um, the uh, the war there. But um, the problem being the that wasn't the end of the war. That was the end of the major part of the war. That was the end of, the really gruesome stuff, the genocide and whatnot, the concentration camps. Um, but the Moro Rebellion remained. The Moro War continued all the way to the 19 teens. Actually, pockets of resistance continued throughout the period, um, throughout U.S. control, and actually kind of remains a problem area for the Philippines even today. And that's because the southern part of the Philippines, the southern islands, were part of what was called the Sulu Sultanate. Um, so they had like a separate ruler in that who declared him the Sultan declared independence as a result of all this fighting in the Philippines, in the rest of the Philippines, even though the Spanish control, he was a vassal of the Spanish, but still technically a separate country from the Philippines. So that's why a lot of the time, if you talk about the Philippine insurrection, this is considered kind of separate. But um, the thing about Moros is that they would often get hyped up on hashish in that and just charge American troops. They'd get shot to pieces, but manage to take out one or two soldiers because they were just berserking. They were incapable of stopping. Um, so the U.S. actually invented what's known as the 1911, because the year 1911 was a Browning pistol that shoots a 45 caliber bullet semi-automatically, specifically to be able to take down these Moros, because the U.S. was still using a double action revolver, and often a 38 caliber, but sometimes 45. So it was time for that. That's how nasty that war got, that the US literally had to invent more lethal pistols in order to defend themselves against these Moro attacks. Um but the but eventually the sovereignty of the Sulu Sultanate was administered as being subservient to the Philippines as a whole, even though they continued to declare independence over and over and over again, and have done so fairly recently, actually. Um, but that's a whole tangled mess. But you can see this was a pretty nasty war, and really soured U.S. opinion on their imperialism. And so um, people started to really oppose U.S. imperialism at home. Um, and you can see here with this comic from 1899 that the donkey here is labeled Philippines. This is obviously supposed to be a caricature of Spain, and you can see just barely that it says 20. It's supposed to say $20 million, but it actually looks like 20,000. But says like $20 million and is just walking away while Uncle Sam here gets roped around the tree of imperialism by the Philippines. Really gets dragged down because of this war. And so there was a lot of debate over whether or not the U.S. should annex any of these territories, even at the in 1898. Um, you had people who took a really moralistic stance about like, oh well, they were fighting for independence, and so we shouldn't annex anything. They should be given full independence right now. Others who were saying like they're not ready for it. They can't just go straight from being a colonial possession of Spain to, under particularly harsh rule to complete independence. We saw that argument being put to the test with Cuba. And people often brought up how like Latin America in general had kind of fallen apart right after gaining independence. After all, Mexico even today is a fairly unstable country, and people were using that as an example as to why there needed to be a period of apprenticeship, and um, so that was the argument, that they couldn't self-determine, and yet that they were too downtrodden to do so. But you also have people making the argument that we shouldn't annex these territories because there's brown people there, and that will dilute the white race more than it already is being diluted by these newly freed slaves. So you have people who are anti-imperialist because of moralistic reasons. You have ones who are anti-imperialist but want to be a little more conservative about it and still are doing so for moralistic reasons. And you have people who are anti-imperialistic for very clearly racist reasons. Forming this kind of alliance to oppose American imperialism at home. So this led to the creation of the American Anti-Imperialist League. And there were many prominent members. Probably the most prominent was Mark Twain, also known as his real name was Samuel Clemens, but you guys know him as Mark Twain. Really famous author, and also, like we had talked about the Gilded Age a couple weeks ago, and he's the one who came up with the name Gilded Age. That's how influential he was. He wasn't just a fun, fiction writer. He was quite a politico. But there were many other people who joined this league. For instance, there was an official alliance between the American Anti-Imperialist League and the early NAACP, which was formed only a few years later. But especially as the Philippines became nastier and nastier, people really started to oppose imperialism at home. When Teddy Roosevelt did become president, he had his own policy that basically was, you've heard it before, speak softly and carry a big stick. Basically, don't try to start wars or anything, but also be capable of defending yourself. And if U.S. interests are hindered, quick, swift action, such as just parking gunboats and saying, "Hey, stop that, or we will intervene," was his entire policy. Basically, he was trying to prevent imperialism by doing the same thing that McKinley did with the USS Maine. So not exactly a coherent policy, but it's still, trying to be anti-imperial. And as the Philippines became nastier and nastier, Congress decided to investigate and started having hearings about all these massacres, the water cure, the concentration camps, and that, and really came into public light because these were public hearings in Congress, which means that they were published by the U.S. And since they're published by the U.S., they don't have any copyright. So that meant that anybody could reprint them without violating copyright. So these things spread quickly, and the reading public learned very quickly that Philippines was not a nice war. And so because of what happened in the Philippines and the result of this war, the US never really has annexed any territory ever again. There are a couple of exceptions. The Danish West Indies were sold to us in 1917. It was a tiny little bit of land. And after World War II, a bunch of the South Pacific was put into what's known as a UN trust territory. And that's how we get like American Samoa. But those were much smaller things and were basically done either by request of those in terms of the Danish West Indies, or in the case of the UN, was kind of to prevent any kind of resurgence of a Japanese empire. In either case, these were not imperial possessions. We never expanded like that again. Also, something that is not in here but worth mentioning is the U.S. simultaneously to all of this also annexed Hawaii due to a coup that happened there that was basically supported by the U.S. The coup imposed self-rule as opposed to the old Hawaiian kingdom, and then requested annexation a couple of years later. And so the U.S. granted that annexation in 1898. So massive expansion of territory, but came at a pretty heart-rending cost. Hopefully next session will be a little bit more fun than this. Rather than talking about genocide, we'll be talking about small wars, but hold on a second. Well, I do that. There we go. So the you can see how this turned from just kind of like a jaunty little war to free Cuba to, you know, literal genocide. And the transition's pretty steady, right? Like, could the US have done anything to prevent this? I'm asking you guys. To prevent turning to genocide.
Ask the question again, I'm sorry.
What could the US have done differently here? Obviously, I think we can all agree that genocide is bad. So
yeah, I mean, that's the kind of...
So what could we have done to prevent that from happening?
Didn't you say that most of the genocide was caused because that they like did something to the farmers so they weren't producing enough crops? What if they'd let people continue to grow their crops and there wouldn't be as much death and much fighting?
Well, part of the reason why the concentration camps were used was because the farmers were basically sheltering the rebels. You know, and by the way, this is actually a very effective strategy, concentrating a population and then, you know, sweeping the countryside. You know, it was a strategy that was working in the northern part of South Vietnam during the Vietnam War and then abandoned. And like, it was one of the few strategies that worked during the Vietnam War. So you'll hear strategists even today calling for, they don't want to call it concentration camps anymore, so they'll call it like internment camps or something along those lines. These are not internment camps. Like what what was done with the Japanese during World War II. That was internment camps. What this was concentration camps, and the basic idea is that you put them in one thing and then you can eliminate the rebels. But it comes at a cost, right? So yeah, not doing the concentration camps certainly would prevent the deaths from concentration camps, obviously, but that would just prolong the war, wouldn't it?
I mean, don't you think things like maybe like assimilation could have been, but then again, with assimilation, you have problems that with itself, you don't want to, what's the word? You don't want to dampen another culture or I guess like exclude it from. So I think that you have to be careful with that. But I mean, they should have been just more willing to accept their culture.
It is a tough question, right? And
Yeah.
there are no correct answers here, but I also want you guys to kind of put yourself in these people's shoes. It's easy to condemn them. It's easy to condemn genocide. I think anybody who has trouble condemning genocide, is not a good person. But it's far more difficult to understand why people turn to genocide. It's not like this wasn't out of hate. Like the genocide was basically a side effect. So, what were the main steps toward this? Where did the U.S. turn to? Why did the U.S. have to turn to concentration camps as opposed to what could have been?
Probably because they wouldn't just give us the resources, and we were like, give us the resources, and they were like, no. And then we were like, well, we'll just take it.
Well,
and
we already had access to the resources we wanted.
And then like they killed our soldiers, and then like we got angry, and then that kind of spiraled out, and then it caused more killing and more until it got to genocidal levels.
So where's the breaking point?
Of like not going that far?
Mm-hmm. Where does it turn to? When does it turn to genocide?
Oh, I would say when both sides are at the height of like their anger towards one another, and neither side will like give up, so they have to turn to extreme measures to try to force the other side to give up.
So when was that? If you want, I can pull up the slides again if that'll help.
But it's like not just in this war, but in multiple wars, it's usually when they start killing our soldiers is when they put the attack on us, is when we decide that like we're not going to take that, and we fight back as hard as we can.
Mm-hmm.
You see that in like World War II also, like with Pearl Harbor, they attacked us, so then we took everything we had and pushed it on them.
Exactly. Yes, and like there's this kind of history of there's this subtle part of American history that's we have these you saw it throughout the Indian Wars. We talked a little bit about that with the Western Indians lecture, but throughout the Indian Wars, you saw like for instance, the California genocide is another perfect example of how this escalates. That you start off with somebody stealing a horse, then there's a raid to go and attack the tribe that had stolen the horse, and then the tribe counterattacks, and then a whole town rises up to form a army to go after this tribe and just exterminate them. And in the California genocide, for instance, they were perfectly willing to use the term exterminate. By the way, the actual word genocide doesn't come about until 1943. So it was created alongside the UN. Um, but we can basically apply it retroactively and say, yeah, that was a genocide. But there is definitely this history of the U.S. kind of overreacting. I mean, the whole war itself was over a ship blowing up, right? Like that's what started it. You know, and you can argue about whether or not it was actually the Spanish who blew it up or anything along those lines, but Spanish did have mines in Havana Harbor. We know that to be true. We also know that the ships blew up on their own like that. So you could argue either way, but it started off with revenge, did it not? And the cycle of violence kept going until it ended up in genocide. So yeah, that's one of the things I tried to show in this class a lot, is that that there is this, it's not just that all this violence in US history and that all this horrific racism and all that kind of stuff is not just because, these are bad people and everything. It's not about, we're not really here to make judgments of these people. What we're here to do is understand why it happened. And when we're talking about things like genocide and that, it's very easy to just continue to just condemn them and move on. But the difficult part is understanding why, because you suddenly have to sympathize with the people doing that. So on that dark note, I figure, we got plenty of snow outside. Go out and have some fun in the snow rather than dwelling on all this dark history. If anybody has any other questions, I will be around. But otherwise, have a nice day. Try not to dwell too much on genocide.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.